The children were singing when Sheriff Daniel Colter found the empty homestead. Their voices echoed from somewhere deep in the hollow, a hymn he did not recognize, the melody rising and falling like wind through the gaps in the mountains. But when he called out, the singing stopped, and the silence that followed was worse than any sound. It was September 14th, 1909. The Morrison family, Jacob, his wife Ruth, and their 4 children, had not been seen in 12 days. Their cabin sat at the end of a narrow trail in eastern Breathitt County, Kentucky, surrounded by ridges so steep that morning fog lingered until afternoon. The door was unlocked. The table was set for supper. A pot of beans had gone to rot on the stove. But the family was gone, all 6 of them, and there was not a single drop of blood anywhere. Sheriff Colter found something else instead. In the center of the main room, arranged in a perfect circle, were 6 white candles. They had burned down completely, leaving pools of hardened wax on the wooden floor. And in the center of that circle was a book, not a Bible, something else. The pages were filled with handwritten prayers in script so beautiful it looked like art, but the words themselves made Colter's skin crawl. This happened in the remote mountains of eastern Kentucky, in a county where secrets could survive for generations. What Sheriff Colter would discover in the next 40 days would force local authorities to seal all records until 1984. And what you are about to hear is the complete truth, reconstructed from documents that were supposed to have been destroyed. And before we descend into the darkness of Breathitt County, if you are drawn to these forgotten corners of American history, the cases that were buried, the mysteries that were erased, the stories they did not want told, you need to subscribe to Appalachian Shadows right now, because every week I bring you a case like this from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Something real in spirit, something disturbing, something that challenges what you thought you knew about faith, community, and the darkness that can hide behind a collar and a cross. And this is one of the most chilling cases I have ever investigated. Sheriff Daniel Colter had served Breathitt County for 11 years. He was 42 years old, a former coal miner who had taken the badge after his father, the previous sheriff, died of black lung disease. Daniel knew every hollow, every ridge, every family in the county. He knew which men could be trusted and which ones made moonshine in the deep woods. He knew where the property lines were, even when there were no fences, and he knew how to settle disputes without violence. But he had never dealt with anything like this. The Morrison family was the 3rd to disappear in 2 months. In July, the Pennington family, a husband, wife, and 3 teenage daughters, had vanished from their farm near Frozen Creek. In August, the Harlan family, an elderly couple and their adult son, had disappeared from their property on the north slope of Troublesome Mountain. Now the Morrisons, 15 people, gone without a trace. Colter stood in the Morrison cabin, studying the circle of candles and the strange book. He picked it up carefully as if it might burn him. The handwriting was immaculate, the kind of penmanship that required education and practice. The prayers were written in English, but they used language that felt wrong. References to ascending through descent, purification through darkness, the sacred womb of the earth, and at the bottom of every page, a signature, Reverend Silas Grim. Colter felt his blood go cold. He knew that name. Everyone in the county knew that name. Reverend Silas Grim had arrived in Breathitt County in March of 1909. He came on foot, walking up from Jackson, carrying nothing but a worn leather Bible and a canvas bag. He was a traveling preacher, he said, called by God to bring revival to the isolated communities of eastern Kentucky. He was not affiliated with any particular church or denomination. He was simply a servant of the Lord, going where he was needed, and he was impossible to forget once you saw him. Grim stood nearly 7 feet tall, towering over every man in the county. His frame was thin but powerful, with broad shoulders and arms that seemed too long for his body. He had straight black hair that fell past his collar, often covering half his face when he leaned forward. His hands were enormous, with fingers so long and thin they looked like spider legs when he gestured during his sermons. But it was his eyes that people remembered most. Reverend Silas Grim had heterochromia. His left eye was pale blue, so light it was almost white in certain angles of sunlight. His right eye was dark brown, nearly black. When he looked at you, it felt like two different people were staring out from behind that gaunt face. And when he smiled, which he did often, the expression never reached those mismatched eyes. His mouth would curve upward, showing teeth that were too white and too perfect, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. He always dressed in black. A black suit, black vest, black tie, black hat. Even in the brutal heat of Kentucky summers, when other men stripped down to shirt sleeves and suspenders, Grim wore his full black uniform. He never seemed to sweat. He never seemed uncomfortable. He simply moved through the world like a shadow, silent and inevitable. When Grim first arrived in the county seat of Jackson, he introduced himself to the local Baptist minister, Reverend Thomas Whitfield. Whitfield later told Sheriff Colter that the meeting had been deeply unsettling. Grim spoke in a voice that was impossibly deep, resonating from somewhere in his chest like distant thunder. He quoted scripture perfectly, referencing chapter and verse without hesitation. But there was something about his theology that troubled Whitfield. Grim spoke often about suffering as a path to enlightenment, about the necessity of descending before ascending, but finding God in the deepest, darkest places of the earth. Whitfield had politely suggested that Grim might find better success preaching in the larger towns to the west. But Grim simply smiled his cold smile and said that God had called him specifically to the mountains, to the isolated hollows where people lived beyond the reach of traditional churches, to families who needed his particular message. And he had been devastatingly successful. Over the spring and summer, Grim traveled from hollow to hollow, holding revival meetings in family homes, barns, and outdoor clearings. He never asked for money. He never demanded lodging. He would simply appear, preach for hours in that thunderous voice, and then disappear into the mountains again. People were drawn to him. His sermons were powerful, speaking to the hardships of mountain life, the suffering that came with isolation and poverty, the promise of salvation for those willing to truly commit. But his message had grown darker over the months. By late summer, Grim was no longer preaching traditional Christianity. He spoke instead of a path he called the sacred descent. He taught that modern Christianity had lost its way, that churches had become corrupted by comfort and prosperity. True salvation, he insisted, required sacrifice. It required going into the earth itself, into the womb of creation, to be reborn in purity. He spoke of a sacred cave system deep in the mountains, a place that had been used by ancient peoples for spiritual ceremonies long before white settlers arrived. A place where the veil between this world and the next was thin. A place where families could ascend to a higher state of being through ritual purification. And families had begun to believe him. Sheriff Colter closed the prayer book and placed it carefully in his satchel. He needed to find Reverend Silas Grim. He needed answers, and he needed them before anyone else disappeared. But first, he needed to understand the pattern. Colter spent the next 3 days reviewing everything he knew about the disappearances. He rode to each empty homestead, documenting what he found. The pattern was consistent across all 3 families. No signs of struggle, no blood, no indication of violence. Food left behind, sometimes still on plates. Doors unlocked, as if the families had simply walked away and intended to return. Personal belongings untouched. Money, jewelry, weapons, all left behind. And in each home, the same circle of white candles. The same prayer book, signed by Silas Grim. But there was something else Colter discovered. Something that had not been immediately obvious. In each empty cabin, he found evidence that the families had packed carefully before leaving. Warm clothes were missing from wardrobes. Sturdy boots were gone. Canteens and rope had been taken. It was as if they were preparing for a journey into the mountains. But they had left behind everything of material value. They had not been taken by force. They had gone willingly. Colter interviewed neighbors and family members of the missing. The stories were consistent. Each family had attended multiple revival meetings led by Reverend Grim. Each family had become increasingly devoted to his teachings. They spoke of the sacred descent. They spoke of being chosen. They spoke of ascending to a higher plane of existence. And each family had mentioned that Grim had shown them something. A map, a location, a sacred place in the mountains where the ritual would occur. Wait, think about this for a second. 3 families, 15 people, all devout Christians from isolated mountain communities, all convinced by a traveling preacher to walk away from their homes, their possessions, their entire lives, to go into the mountains for a ritual that would purify them. Drop a comment right now with your theory, because this detail is going to matter at the end, and I want to see if anyone figures it out before we get there. Colter knew he needed help. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in neighboring counties, asking if they had experienced similar disappearances or had any information about Reverend Silas Grim. The responses that came back over the following week were disturbing. A sheriff in Perry County reported that a preacher matching Grim's description had been in his area the previous year. 2 families had disappeared after attending his meetings. The families were never found, and the preacher had moved on before any official investigation could begin. A sheriff in Leslie County had a similar story. 3 families gone in the autumn of 1907. A tall preacher with mismatched eyes. Revival meetings focused on descent and purification. The pattern stretched back years, across at least 6 counties in eastern Kentucky. Dozens of families, perhaps more than 100 people. And Reverend Silas Grim had been moving through the mountains like a plague, leaving emptiness in his wake. But where were the bodies? If these families had been murdered, where were the remains? The mountains were vast, but search parties had combed the areas around the empty homesteads. Bloodhounds had found nothing. There should have been some evidence, some trace, unless they were still alive somewhere, hidden, held captive, or unless they had gone willingly into a place so remote, so hidden, that no one had thought to look there yet. Colter decided to interview people who had attended Grim's revival meetings but had not disappeared. He needed to understand what the preacher was teaching, what he was offering, what could convince entire families to abandon everything. He found a woman named Martha Breckenridge who lived in the Quicksand Creek area. Martha was in her 50s, a widow who lived alone since her children had moved west. She had attended 3 of Grim's meetings in August, but had stopped going after the 3rd. Martha invited Colter into her small cabin and poured him coffee with trembling hands. When he asked about Reverend Grim, her face went pale. "That man is not right," she said quietly. "There is something wrong with him. Something evil." She described the revival meetings. How Grim would preach for hours, his voice never wavering, never growing hoarse. How he would pace back and forth like a caged animal, his long shadow stretching across the walls in the lamplight. How his mismatched eyes would fix on individuals in the crowd, making them feel seen and chosen and terrified all at once. His message was seductive, Martha explained. He spoke to the suffering that mountain people knew intimately. The poverty, the isolation, the feeling of being forgotten by God and country. He offered them something precious, the promise of transcendence, of becoming something more than their hard, limited lives had allowed. But the 3rd meeting had been different. That night, Grim had brought a map, a hand-drawn map showing a location deep in the mountains, beyond the highest ridges, in an area that was rarely traveled. He called it the Gateway. He said it was a cave system that descended more than 1,000 feet into the earth, that ancient peoples had used it for sacred ceremonies, that the limestone walls contained symbols older than memory. And he said that on October 15th, during the new moon, he would lead the chosen families to the gateway for the ritual of sacred descent. Those who participated would be purified. They would ascend to a higher state of consciousness. They would become one with the divine essence of creation. Those who refused would remain trapped in their suffering, alone, forgotten, lost. Martha said that several families had committed that night. They had signed their names in Grim's prayer book. They had vowed to prepare themselves spiritually and physically for the journey. They had been told to tell no one outside the group. That secrecy was essential. That doubt and fear from outsiders could corrupt the ritual. Martha had refused. Something in Grim's eyes when he looked at her made her blood run cold. She had walked out of that meeting and never returned. 2 weeks later, 3 of the families who had committed to the ritual were gone. Sheriff Colter felt ice forming in his gut. October 15th was in 3 weeks. If Grim was planning another ritual, more families could disappear. He needed to find the preacher now. "Do you know where this gateway is?" Colter asked. "Do you remember anything from the map?" Martha shook her head. He showed it too briefly, but I remember he said it was beyond Frozen Fork, up past the old Morrison property, in an area locals call the Devil's Washboard, because the ridges are so steep and close together. He said you could only find it if you knew exactly where to look, that there were 3 waterfalls, and you had to climb beside the 3rd one to reach the entrance. Colter knew the area she described. It was some of the most rugged terrain in the county, a maze of ridges and hollows where even experienced hunters sometimes got lost. If Grim had found a cave system there, it could be massive and completely hidden. He would need to organize a search party, but he would have to be careful. If Grim had sympathizers in the community, people who believed his teachings, word of the search could reach him before Colter could find the cave. The sheriff spent the next week quietly recruiting men he trusted. He chose carefully. Samuel Brennan, a former Army scout who knew the mountains better than anyone. William Hayes, a coal miner who understood cave systems and their dangers. Robert Thorne, a doctor from Jackson who could provide medical assistance if they found survivors. And Marcus Webb, Colter's deputy, a young man with a steady hand and a clear head. They told no one their true purpose. They gathered supplies quietly, rope, torches, weapons. They studied maps of the Frozen Fork area, looking for likely locations for a major cave entrance. And on September 28, 1909, they rode into the mountains to find Reverend Silas Grim and whatever horror he had been preparing in the darkness beneath the ridges. The journey to the Devil's Washboard took most of a day. The terrain was exactly as Martha had described. Steep ridges, separated by narrow hollows, the landscape folding in on itself like wrinkled fabric. The trails were barely visible, overgrown with laurel and rhododendron that formed tunnels of green shadow. They found the first waterfall by mid-afternoon. It was a modest cascade, maybe 20 feet high, feeding a clear stream that ran between moss-covered boulders. They continued upstream. The second waterfall was larger, more dramatic, the water crashing down in a white veil that created a constant mist in the hollow. They camped that night near the base of the second falls. As darkness fell, Samuel Brennan pointed out something disturbing. There were marks on the surrounding trees, symbols carved into the bark. They looked ancient, worn smooth by decades of weather. But some were fresh, the exposed wood still bright and raw. Someone had been marking a trail. The next morning, they found the third waterfall. It was hidden behind a wall of rhododendron, accessible only by climbing over a tumble of massive boulders. The waterfall was taller than the others, perhaps 40 feet. Falling into a deep pool surrounded by sheer rock walls. And beside it, partially concealed by vegetation, was an opening in the rock face. The cave entrance was narrow, maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet high. Water dripped steadily from the limestone above, and the air that flowed from the opening was cold and damp, carrying the smell of earth and minerals and something else. Something organic and wrong. Sheriff Colter lit a torch and stepped inside. The cave swallowed them whole. Within 50 feet of the entrance, daylight disappeared completely. The torches cast dancing shadows on walls that glistened with moisture, and their footsteps echoed in ways that made it impossible to judge the size of the space around them. The passage sloped steadily downward, the limestone floor worn smooth by centuries of water flow. Sheriff Colter led the way, with Samuel Brennan close behind, marking their path with chalk on the walls. They had brought enough rope to descend several hundred feet if necessary, and William Hayes carried mining equipment, pulleys, pitons, hammers, in case they needed to navigate vertical shafts. The passage narrowed and widened unpredictably. Sometimes they had to turn sideways to squeeze through gaps in the rock. Other times they entered chambers so vast that their torchlight could not reach the ceiling. Strange formations hung from above and rose from below. Stalactites and stalagmites that looked like teeth in a massive mouth. And everywhere, carved into the walls, were symbols. Some were clearly ancient. Weather-worn and shallow, they depicted spirals, handprints, and geometric patterns that anthropologists would have recognized as pre-Columbian. But others were fresh, recently carved. And these showed different imagery. Descending figures, circles within circles, and something that looked disturbingly like bodies arranged in ritualistic positions. Dr. Thorne paused to examine one of the newer carvings, running his fingers over the grooves. "This was made within the last few months," he said quietly. "You can still see tool marks. Someone has been preparing this place." They continued deeper. The air grew colder. The smell intensified. That organic wrongness that Colter had noticed at the entrance became unmistakable. It was the smell of decay, of something that had died in the darkness and been left to rot. After what Colter estimated was half a mile of descent, they entered a chamber that stopped them all in their tracks. It was enormous, a cathedral of stone with a ceiling that disappeared into shadow somewhere far above. But what made them freeze was what covered the floor. Candles, hundreds of white candles arranged in concentric circles. Most had burned down completely, but some still had wax pooled at their bases. And in the center of the circles was a platform, a natural formation of limestone that rose about 3 feet off the cave floor, worn smooth as if by human hands. On that platform were chains, iron chains bolted into the rock. 4 sets of them, wrist shackles and ankle shackles, arranged as if to hold people in a spread-eagle position. And the shackles were stained with something dark that looked like dried blood. "Dear God," Deputy Webb whispered. Sheriff Colter approached the platform slowly, his torch held high. The blood was not old. It was recent enough that it still had color, still glistened slightly in the firelight. He counted the chains, 4 sets, but the blood pattern suggested more than 4 people had been here. Much more. On the walls surrounding the chamber, the carvings became more elaborate and more disturbing. They showed scenes that Colter's mind struggled to process. Figures descending into the earth. Groups of people gathered around a central platform. Bodies lying motionless, while a tall figure with arms raised stood above them. And at the far end of the chamber, carved larger than all the others, was an image that made Colter's blood go cold. A man with 2 different eyes, one light, one dark. His arms stretched wide, his mouth open in what could have been a scream or a laugh or a prayer. "He brought them here," Samuel Brennan said. His voice echoed strangely in the vast space. Grim brought those families here for whatever ritual he was performing. "But where are they now?" Webb asked. "Where are the bodies?" William Hayes had been exploring the perimeter of the chamber. He called out from the far side, "There is another passage here. It goes deeper." They regrouped and examined the new passage. It was wider than the entrance tunnel, tall enough to walk upright. The walls here were different, not natural limestone formations, but showing evidence of human modification. Someone had widened this passage deliberately, smoothing the walls and leveling the floor. And there were drag marks, long dark streaks on the stone floor that led into the darkness beyond. Sheriff Colter felt his hand tighten on his revolver. "Stay close," he ordered, "and stay alert." They followed the passage deeper into the mountain. The descent became steeper. They had to use ropes in several places where the floor dropped away into short vertical sections. Hayes estimated they had descended at least 300 feet below the entrance by now, maybe more. The pressure in Colter's ears confirmed they were going deep. The smell of decay grew stronger, and then they began to hear sounds. At first, Colter thought it was water, a distant dripping or flowing. But as they moved closer, the sound resolved into something different, something rhythmic, something that might have been breathing. They entered another chamber. This one was smaller than the cathedral space, but the ceiling was still beyond their torchlight. And this chamber was not empty. There were structures here, wooden frames built against the walls. Crude but sturdy, constructed from timber that must have been carried down piece by piece over many trips. The frames created partitions, like stalls in a barn, And behind those wooden bars in the darkness, things moved. Colter raised his torch higher. And then he saw the faces, people, dozens of people. They huddled in the wooden stalls, their eyes wide and empty, their clothes filthy and torn. They did not speak. They did not cry out. They simply stared at the torchlight as if they had forgotten what light was, as if it hurt them to see it. Jesus Christ, Dr. Thorne breathed. He moved forward immediately, his medical instincts overriding his fear. These people need help. They need water and food, and he stopped. One of the figures had moved into the torchlight, and what they saw made them understand that rescue would not be simple. It was a woman. She might have been 30 or 50. It was impossible to tell. Her hair had gone completely white. Her skin was so pale it was almost translucent. Her eyes were vacant, focused on nothing. She moved like a sleepwalker, her steps mechanical and purposeless. And her mouth was moving, whispering something over and over in a voice so soft they could barely hear it. Descend to ascend. Descend to ascend. Descend to ascend. Dr. Thorne approached her slowly, speaking gently. Ma'am, can you hear me? My name is Robert Thorne. I'm a doctor. We are here to help you. The woman did not respond. She continued whispering her mantra, swaying slightly, her eyes never focusing on anything. Thorne turned to the others. They have been drugged or subjected to some form of psychological conditioning. Maybe both. I have seen similar states in patients who experience severe trauma, but this is more extreme than anything in my experience. Sheriff Colter counted the stalls. 14 of them, and in each one, people huddled in various states of awareness. Some sat motionless. Others rocked back and forth. A few whispered that same phrase, descend to ascend. Check them for injuries, Colter ordered. See if you can identify any of them. As Dr. Thorne and Deputy Webb began examining the prisoners, Colter and the others searched the rest of the chamber. They found evidence of recent habitation, blankets, water containers, food stores. Someone had been maintaining these people, keeping them alive but imprisoned in the darkness. And then Samuel Brennan found the journal. It was tucked into a natural alcove in the wall, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Brennan opened it carefully and held it to the torchlight. The handwriting was the same beautiful script they had seen in the prayer books. And the signature at the bottom of the first page confirmed their worst fear. The journal of Reverend Silas Grim, a record of the sacred descent. Colter took the journal and began reading aloud to the others. The entries went back 3 years. Grim had been planning this for longer than any of them had realized. He had studied cave systems throughout the Appalachian Mountains, searching for the perfect location. He had researched indigenous spiritual practices and ancient rituals. He had developed a theology that blended Christianity, mysticism, and something darker. His goal, as he described it in flowery language, was to create a new form of human consciousness. He believed that modern society had corrupted the human spirit, that people had become too attached to material possessions, too comfortable in their sins, too weak to embrace true spiritual transformation. The sacred descent was his solution. By bringing people deep into the earth, by subjecting them to isolation and deprivation and ritualistic conditioning, he could break down their old selves and rebuild them as pure vessels for divine truth. The families he had taken were not victims. They were volunteers. He had convinced them that they were chosen, special, that their suffering would lead to enlightenment. And if this investigation is drawing you in so far, tap that like button. It genuinely helps Appalachian Shadows bring more of these forgotten cases to light. These stories from the mountains deserve to be told. But the journal revealed something even more disturbing. The entries became increasingly unhinged as they progressed. Grim had started to believe he himself was divine, that God had chosen him specifically for this work, that the cave was not just a location, but a living entity, a womb that would birth a new form of humanity. And the final entries described his plans for October 15th, the new moon, the culmination of his work. He would bring the last group of families to the gateway. He would perform the final ritual. And those who survived would emerge transformed, ready to spread his message throughout the mountains. Those who did not survive would simply remain in the earth, feeding the darkness that had given birth to them. He's completely insane, Dr. Thorne said quietly. And if there is another group coming here in 2 weeks, we need to find Grim now and stop this. But Samuel Brennan was studying the journal more closely. He flipped to the final pages and his face went pale. Sheriff, you need to read this. The last entry was dated September 27th, yesterday, the day before they had entered the cave. It read, "They are coming. I can feel them approaching. The doubters, the unbelievers, those who cannot understand the sacred work being done here. But they are too late. The transformation is nearly complete, and when they descend seeking to stop me, they will discover that the gateway has already opened, that the darkness welcomes everyone equally, that there is no escape from the earth's embrace." Sheriff Colter felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He knows we are here. And then the torches went out, all of them, simultaneously, as if something had passed through the chamber and extinguished every flame in a single breath. They were plunged into absolute darkness, the kind of darkness that exists only deep underground, where no light has ever penetrated, where the absence of light is so complete that it becomes a physical presence, pressing against your eyes, filling your lungs, wrapping around your throat. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was their breathing and the continued whispers of the prisoners. Descend to ascend, descend to ascend. Then they heard footsteps. Someone was walking through the chamber, not running, not hurrying, just walking with slow, deliberate steps. And the footsteps were wrong, too heavy, too measured, as if each step was being placed with careful intention. "Light the torches," Colter hissed. He heard Hayes fumbling with matches, heard the scratch of sulfur against stone. But the matches would not catch. Hayes struck them again and again, but they would not ignite. The footsteps came closer, and then a voice echoed through the darkness. That impossibly deep voice that resonated from somewhere inhuman. "Welcome, Sheriff Colter. I've been expecting you." A light appeared. A single candle, held by a hand with fingers so long they looked like bone. And in that flickering light they saw him. Reverend Silas Grim stood in the center of the chamber. His black suit was filthy with cave mud. His hair hung loose around his face, and his mismatched eyes reflected the candlelight like an animal's eyes, glowing with colors that should not exist in human tissue. He smiled, that terrible smile that never reached his eyes. "You should not have come here," Grim said. "This place is sacred, and you have defiled it with your doubt, with your fear, with your pathetic attempt to interfere with God's work." Sheriff Colter drew his revolver. His hand was steady despite the terror crawling through his veins. "Silas Grim, you are under arrest for kidnapping, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit murder. You will come with us peacefully, or I will shoot you where you stand." Grim laughed. The sound echoed in ways that hurt the ears, that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. "You cannot arrest me, Sheriff. I am beyond your authority now. I have descended so deep into the sacred darkness that I have touched the face of God himself. And what I have learned there will transform this world, whether you believe it or not." He took a step forward. His shadow stretched across the wall behind him, and in that shadow they could see something wrong. Something that moved independently of Grim's body. Something with too many limbs and too many angles. Colter aimed at Grim's chest. "Last warning, come peacefully or I will fire." "Then fire," Grim said, "and see how far your bullets travel in a place like this. Where the walls listen, where the darkness has teeth. Be honest with me in the comments. If you were Sheriff Colter, would you have pulled the trigger? Or would you have tried to reason with Grim one more time? Because I have thought about this a lot while researching this case, and I am still not sure there was a right answer. What happened next would haunt everyone who survived that day for the rest of their lives. Sheriff Colter pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. The muzzle flash illuminated the chamber in a brief explosion of light. And Sheriff Daniel Colter, a man who had served his community for 11 years, who had hunted deer and bear in these mountains since childhood, who had fired his weapon in anger only twice before, Sheriff Colter saw his bullet strike Reverend Silas Grim directly in the chest. The impact staggered Grim backward. His candle fell from his hand. In the dying light, they saw the dark stain spreading across his black suit, saw him drop to one knee, and then the darkness returned. But this time it was different. The darkness began to move, to writhe and twist like something alive. They could feel it pressing against them, cold and wet and impossibly heavy. And from somewhere in that darkness came sounds, whispers, hundreds of voices speaking in unison, saying words that hurt to hear, that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and burrow straight into the mind. "Light!" Colter shouted. "Someone get light!" William Hayes finally got a match to strike. The tiny flame seemed impossibly fragile in that vast darkness. He touched it to his torch, and the oil-soaked rag caught fire, spreading blessed light through the chamber once more. But Reverend Silas Grim was gone. Where he had fallen, there was blood. A pool of it, dark and thick, but no body. The blood trail led toward the far passage, the one that descended even deeper into the mountain. "He could not have gone far," Deputy Webb said, his voice shaking. "Not with a wound like that." Dr. Thorne was already checking the blood. He touched it, examined it in the torchlight. His expression was troubled. "This blood is wrong. The viscosity is not right. The color is too dark. I've seen thousands of gunshot wounds in my career, and I have never seen blood quite like this." Samuel Brennan was standing near the wooden stalls, looking at the prisoners. "Sheriff, we need to get these people out of here, now. Whatever Grim is, whatever this place is, we need to leave immediately." Colter made a decision. "Brennan, you and Webb start bringing them up. Use the rope system, get them to the entrance, and then down the mountain to Jackson. Send word to the state authorities. Tell them we need doctors, deputies, maybe the militia." "What about you?" Brennan asked. "Dr. Thorne, Hayes, and I are going after Grim. We cannot let him escape. Not after what he has done." "Sheriff, that is suicide," Brennan protested. "You saw what happened. The torch is going out. That shadow. Whatever is down there, it is not natural. All the more reason we need to stop him before October 15th, Colter said. "Go, that is an order." Brennan and Webb began organizing the prisoners. It was like trying to move sleepwalkers. The people responded to physical guidance, but showed no initiative of their own. They moved when pushed, stopped when left alone. Getting them up 300 feet of cave passages and then down the mountain would take hours, maybe days. But Colter, Thorne, and Hayes could not wait. They followed the blood trail deeper into the mountain. The passage descended steeply, more steeply than anything they had encountered before. They had to use rope for almost every section, lowering themselves hand over hand into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The blood continued, smeared on the walls, where Grim must have steadied himself, pooled in depressions in the floor. But there was too much blood. A man who had lost this much should have collapsed by now. Should have died. Unless Dr. Thorne was right. Unless the blood was not quite human. After what felt like hours of descent, the passage opened into yet another chamber. But this one was different from the others. This one felt old. Ancient in a way that predated human presence in these mountains by millennia. The walls here were covered in those pre-Columbian symbols, but also in formations they had never seen before. The limestone had grown in strange patterns, creating shapes that almost looked deliberate, almost looked like writing in some language that human minds were not meant to read. And in the center of the chamber was a pit. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 20 feet across, dropping straight down into darkness so absolute that their torchlight could not penetrate it. The stone around the pit was worn smooth, as if countless hands had gripped it over countless years. And rising from that pit was a sound, a breathing sound, slow and rhythmic, like something massive sleeping in the depths below. Reverend Silas Grim stood at the edge of that pit. He was still alive, though the front of his suit was soaked with blood. His mismatched eyes were fixed on the darkness below, and his lips were moving in silent prayer. "Grim!" Colter called out. "It is over. Step away from the edge." Grim did not turn to face them. He simply continued staring into the pit, his voice finally becoming audible. "You understand nothing, Sheriff. You came here thinking you were saving people, stopping a madman, bringing justice to your precious mountain communities." He laughed, and the sound echoed from the pit, amplified and distorted. "But you were just playing your part in the design. You were meant to come here, meant to follow me to this place. Because the gateway requires blood, and the blood of doubters is the most powerful of all." Grim turned to face them finally, and they saw that the gunshot wound had not killed him because it had not hit anything vital. The bullet had passed through his chest, missing his heart by inches. He should have been unconscious from blood loss, should have been dying. But his eyes were bright and alert, and in the torchlight they could see that the wound was closing. The flesh was knitting itself back together with a speed that was impossible. "What are you?" Dr. Thorne whispered. "I am the vessel," Grim said simply. "I am the mouth through which the earth speaks. I came to these mountains as a man, weak, mortal, filled with doubt and fear. But when I first descended into this cave 3 years ago, when I first heard the breathing from the pit, I understood what I was meant to become." He gestured to the pit behind him. "There are things sleeping in the deep places of the world, Sheriff. Things that were ancient when your god was still being imagined by primitive minds trying to explain lightning. Things that exist in the spaces between matter, between thought, between life and death." "You are insane," Colter said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Because what they were seeing could not be explained by insanity alone." Grim smiled. "Perhaps. But insanity and enlightenment often look identical to those still trapped in conventional understanding. The families I brought here were not victims, Sheriff. They were willing participants in something greater than themselves. And they will emerge from this place transformed, elevated, no longer bound by the limitations of flesh and fear." "The people we found in those cells were not transformed," Hayes said angrily. "They were broken, traumatized. You destroyed them." "I broke them down so they could be rebuilt," Grim corrected. "The process is not gentle. True transformation never is. But those who survive will inherit a world that the rest of you cannot even imagine." He took a step backward. His heel touched the edge of the pit. "And now, Sheriff, you have given me exactly what was needed. Your bullets, your blood on the stone, your fear soaking into the limestone. The gateway is ready to open fully. Stop!" Colter raised his revolver again. "I will shoot again." "Please do," Grim said. "Every drop of blood helps." And then he fell backward into the pit. Not jumped, not dove, simply leaned back and allowed gravity to take him. His arms spread wide, his face serene, falling into that absolute darkness as if he were falling into an embrace. The 3 men rushed to the edge and looked down. The pit was deep, perhaps 100 feet, perhaps 1,000. Their torchlight could not find the bottom, and Grim had disappeared into that darkness without a sound. No scream, no impact, just silence. And then the breathing sound from the pit changed. It became faster, louder, the rhythm shifting from the slow, deep pattern of sleep to something more active, more aware. "We need to leave," Dr. Thorne said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Right now." But before they could move, something emerged from the pit. Not Grim, something else. It was shadow-given form, a darkness that was somehow darker than the surrounding darkness, a presence that bent light around it and made the air taste like copper and rot. It rose from the pit slowly, impossibly, defying gravity and reason, spreading across the ceiling of the chamber like oil spreading across water. And from within that shadow, they heard Grim's voice. But it was not just his voice. It was many voices speaking in unison, dozens, hundreds, maybe more. "The gateway is open. The descent is complete. And now the ascension begins." Sheriff Colter fired his remaining bullets into the shadow. They disappeared into the darkness without any visible effect. William Hayes threw his torch at it, and the flames were extinguished before the torch reached its target. Dr. Thorne grabbed Colter's arm and pulled him toward the passage they had come from. They ran. The shadow pursued them, flowing through the passage like water, always just behind them, close enough that they could feel its cold breath on their necks. They climbed desperately, their hands torn and bleeding from the rough rope, their lungs burning from exertion and terror. Behind them, the mountain itself seemed to be waking up. They heard rumbling from deep below, felt tremors in the rock, heard sounds that might have been the limestone cracking or might have been something else, something that had been sleeping for a very long time and was now stirring. They reached the chamber where they had left Brennan and Webb with the prisoners, but it was empty now. The wooden stalls stood open. The prisoners were gone, and the walls were covered with fresh carvings. Hundreds of symbols carved so recently that the stone dust still hung in the air. The symbols showed a figure emerging from the earth, arms spread wide, eyes blazing with two different lights. And beneath that figure, hundreds of smaller figures bowing in worship or fear or both. They did not stop to examine the carvings more closely. They kept running. The shadow behind them had stopped pursuing. But the mountain was still waking up. The tremors were becoming stronger. Small rocks were falling from the ceiling. The passages that had been stable for millennia were beginning to collapse. They reached the cathedral chamber with the candles and chains. It was filled with light now, not torchlight, but a pale, sick light that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the limestone that was now glowing with a faint phosphorescence. And standing in the center of that chamber were the prisoners, all of them. Brennan and Webb were there too, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They stood perfectly still, arranged in precise circles, their mouths moving in unison. Descend to ascend, descend to ascend, descend to ascend. Sheriff Colter tried to reach them, tried to shake Brennan out of his trance. But his deputy did not respond, did not even seem to recognize him. The conditioning had taken hold completely. A sound from above made Colter look up. The ceiling of the chamber was splitting open. Cracks were spreading across the limestone like spider webs, and through those cracks they could see daylight. Blessed, beautiful daylight. The mountain was collapsing. "Go!" Colter shouted to Thorne and Hayes. "Get to the entrance." "What about these people?" Hayes protested. "They are gone. Whatever happened to them, we cannot save them now." It was the hardest decision Colter would ever make, abandoning dozens of people, including his own deputy, to whatever fate the mountain had in store for them. But he could see in their eyes that they were no longer fully present, that whatever Grim had done to them had taken something essential away. Colter, Thorne, and Hayes ran for the entrance passage as the chamber collapsed behind them. They could hear the prisoners still chanting, even as tons of rock fell around them. Descend to ascend, descend to ascend. They emerged from the cave entrance just as the entire cliff face began to slide. The waterfall was diverted by the rockfall, the stream rerouted, and within minutes the entrance was completely buried beneath hundreds of tons of limestone rubble. The three men collapsed on the rocks beside the new waterfall path, gasping for air, their clothes torn and filthy, their hands bleeding. They lay there for a long time, listening to the mountain settle, watching dust rise from the collapsed entrance. "What do we tell people?" Hayes finally asked. "How do we explain what happened down there?" Sheriff Colter sat up slowly. His face was gray with exhaustion and something deeper, something like grief or guilt or the terrible weight of impossible knowledge. "We tell them the truth, and then we seal the records, because no one will believe us. And even if they did believe us, there is nothing anyone can do now." Dr. Thorne was staring at the collapsed entrance. "Do you think they are still alive down there? Grim and the prisoners?" "I do not know," Colter said quietly. "But I think whatever opened in that pit, whatever Grim became or released, it cannot get out now. The mountain has sealed itself. Maybe that is enough." They made their way down the mountain slowly, painfully. By the time they reached Jackson, it was dawn of the next day. They went directly to the courthouse and filed their report with the circuit judge. The report was detailed, factual, and completely insane. The judge, a practical man named Henry Morrison, read the report twice. Then he looked at the three men, exhausted, traumatized, covered in cave mud and blood, and made a decision. "This report will be sealed," he said, "for 75 years, by order of the Circuit Court of Breathitt County. The official statement will be that a cave collapse killed approximately 40 people who were exploring without proper equipment. The bodies could not be recovered. The case is closed." "But that is not the truth," Colter protested weakly. "The truth," Judge Morrison said heavily, "is not always what people need to hear. especially when the truth includes things that cannot be explained or understood. You have done your duty, Sheriff. You went into that mountain and you came back out. More than that cannot be asked of any man. Over the following weeks, families were notified that their loved ones had died in a tragic accident. There were no bodies to bury, so memorial services were held instead. The entrance to the cave system was officially declared too dangerous for future exploration, and the area was closed to the public. Life in Breathitt County slowly returned to normal. Slowly, but it was never quite the same normal as before. Sheriff Daniel Colter served for 7 more years before retiring. He never spoke publicly about what had happened in the cave, but those who knew him said that he had changed, that he would sometimes stare at the mountains with an expression that was part fear and part something else, something like watching, waiting. Dr. Robert Thorne moved away from Jackson within a year. He established a practice in Louisville and became a specialist in treating patients with severe psychological trauma. He published several papers on dissociative disorders and conditioning techniques, though he never mentioned the source of his expertise. William Hayes returned to coal mining, but he refused to work in the deepest shafts. He would only work near the surface, where daylight was visible from the tunnel entrance. His fellow miners thought he had developed a fear of cave-ins. They did not know the real reason. The sealed records remained sealed until 1984, when they were briefly opened during a historical research project. The researchers who read them dismissed most of the content as the ravings of men who had experienced severe trauma and possible oxygen deprivation in the cave. The report was resealed and forgotten again. But there are details that cannot be explained away so easily. In October of 1909, 2 weeks after the cave collapse, farmers near Frozen Fork reported seeing lights on the mountain. Pale, flickering lights that moved through the forest at night. The lights appeared every night during the new moon and then disappeared until the next month. This pattern continued for 3 years, and then it stopped. In 1912, a traveling preacher arrived in Perry County. He was tall, dressed in black, and had mismatched eyes. He held one revival meeting before disappearing. No families went missing, but several people who attended that meeting reported having dreams about descending into the earth. Dreams so vivid that they woke screaming. The preacher was never seen again, and in the decades since, there have been occasional reports from throughout the Appalachian Mountains. Reports of caves that should not exist. Of passages that seem to descend farther than geology allows, of sounds from deep underground that might be wind or water or something else, something that breathes slowly and waits patiently for the next person curious enough or desperate enough or faithful enough to descend. The Devil's Washboard area remains largely unexplored to this day. The rockfall that sealed the cave entrance has been colonized by vegetation. Trees grow where the entrance once was. Hikers who pass through the area report feeling watched, feeling as if the mountain itself is aware of their presence. And on certain nights, if you stand near that third waterfall and listen carefully, some say you can still hear it, faint and distant, echoing from somewhere far below the earth. Descend to ascend, descend to ascend, descend to ascend. Sheriff Daniel Colter died in 1931. He was 64 years old. His obituary mentioned his long service to Breathitt County and his reputation as a fair and dedicated lawman. It did not mention the 40 people who disappeared on his watch. It did not mention the cave or the preacher or the thing that woke up in the darkness. But at his funeral, his grandson found something in the pocket of the suit Colter had requested to be buried in. It was a small stone, a piece of limestone carved with a symbol. 2 circles, one light and one dark, overlapping. And on the back, in Colter's handwriting, a single sentence: "Some doors should never be opened." The Appalachian Mountains hold their secrets in hollows deeper than any map can show. They hold memories in stone older than human language, and they hold warnings that echo through the years for anyone willing to listen. What we can say with certainty is that Reverend Silas Grim convinced at least 40 people to follow him into darkness. that he used their faith, their suffering, and their desperate hope for transcendence to lead them into the earth, and that whatever ritual he was performing in that cave was interrupted, but perhaps not stopped. Because true believers never truly die. They transform. They descend into the places where light cannot reach. And they wait. This was the disturbing story of Reverend Silas Grim and the sacred descent. A reminder that faith without wisdom is dangerous. That charisma without morality is poison. That the mountains remember everything and forgive nothing. Another shadow from the Appalachian hollows that deserves to be remembered. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person Appalachian Shadows exists for. Someone who does not turn away from the darkness. Someone who wants to understand the truth buried in these mountains, no matter how disturbing. Next week, I am bringing you the story of the Harlan County nurse who discovered what was really happening in the abandoned sanatorium on Black Mountain in 1917, and why she disappeared 3 days after reporting it to authorities. And that case, it makes this one look tame. Subscribe to Appalachian Shadows now and turn on notifications, because these stories from the hollows and ridges do not stay buried forever. One more thing. I know many of you watching are from Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, the Carolinas, Appalachian country. If your family has stories like this, cases that were hushed up, disappearances that were never solved, secrets that were buried in the hollows, share them in the comments. You do not have to use names, just the story. Because I read every single comment, and your stories might become the next investigation here on Appalachian Shadows.